Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. They say blood runs deep, but in some places it runs in circles. Imagine being born into a world where your mother is also your sister. A world where family ties aren't just tangled, but strangled by secrecy, shame, and the weight of generations repeating the same unspeakable sin. It sounds like the plot of a nightmare, but it is not. This story is real, and it left behind a child whose very existence should have been impossible. The child was called a miracle by some, a curse by others, but in truth he was a living scar, carved into history by a family that could not escape itself. We don't like to speak about these families. They are the shadows of America, hidden in cabins deep in the hills, in small towns where the outside world rarely visits, and yet their stories refuse to stay buried. In the silence of their bloodlines, something darker grows, not just deformities of the body, but deformities of the soul. A heritage of secrets locked behind doors that no stranger dares to open. This particular story begins not with a child, but with a choice. A choice made by a man and a woman who shared more than just a household. They shared the same mother, brother, and sister. Their union was not born of love, as most understand it, but of something twisted, an inheritance of isolation, of poverty, of a community that turned away and left them to themselves. No one was there to intervene. No one came to stop what was happening behind those thin wooden walls. And when the girl became pregnant, the family did what families like This often do. They closed ranks. They whispered instead of speaking. They hid instead of confessing. And when the child was born, there were no celebrations, no laughter, no visitors, only silence. The silence of a baby whose first cry already carried the weight of 1,000 sins. What became of that child is a story too disturbing to ignore. A child who should never have existed. A child born from a mother who was also his sister. The most inbred child in history. The child's name is not often recorded, and perhaps that is fitting. History has a way of erasing those it cannot bear to look at, but the silence around him only makes his presence more haunting. He lived, he breathed, he carried within his veins the undeniable proof of what happens when family becomes both parent and sibling. Every glance at his face was a reminder of the act that made him. Neighbors spoke of him only in whispers, if they spoke at all. They described his features as off, though few dared to be specific. His eyes seemed to drift, never settling in the same direction, as if even they were confused about where they belonged. His jawline, underdeveloped, made speaking difficult, and when he did manage words, they came out broken, slurred, like a language half-formed. The cruelty of children, of course, made sure these differences were never forgotten. But in truth, the adults were no kinder. His existence was a stain on the entire bloodline, a truth they all wished could vanish. But here is what few understand. Such a child was not an accident of chance. He was the inevitable conclusion of a cycle repeating itself over generations. This was not the first time blood had folded back on itself in that family, and it would not be the last. To look at him was to see the accumulated weight of decades of silence. Generations had chosen to hide instead of confront, to excuse instead of prevent, and the result of that cowardice stood there in the form of one fragile boy. In many ways, he never stood a chance. His mind developed slower than others. His body grew weaker. Tasks that most children would master within months took him years, and yet he lived long enough to become a mirror for everyone around him. They saw in him what they were too afraid to admit about themselves. They had let this happen. They had turned away until it was too late. And so the boy grew under the heavy gaze of a community that despised him, yet could not look away. Each year he survived was another year they were forced to face the monster they had created not in him but in themselves. As the boy grew, his world remained unbearably small. He lived in a house that felt more like a prison, where the walls carried whispers of sins too heavy to speak aloud. His mother, who was also his sister, looked at him with a fractured kind of love, torn between guilt, shame, and an instinct she couldn't escape. His father, his uncle, his brother, all the same man, shifted between anger and denial, a figure who both created him and despised him for existing. In that household, silence was louder than screams. Children in nearby villages would point, laugh, and then run when they saw him. They called him the mistake, the cursed one, sometimes nothing at all. He had no place in games, no place in classrooms, no place in the simple rituals of childhood. His body bore the marks of what he was, but his soul bore something far heavier, the knowledge, however dim, that he was not like the others, and never would be. Stories like his remind us of something society wants desperately to forget. Families like his are not accidents. They are not sudden tragedies. They are legacies, stretched across generations like cracks in a foundation, widening with every year until the house collapses. This boy was the collapse made flesh. Every glance, every whisper, every mocking laugh was not just about him. It was about everything his family had done to create him. And yet, perhaps the most chilling detail is not what happened to him, but what did not happen. There was no rescue. No officials stormed the door to take him away. No doctors offered treatment. No teachers intervened. He was allowed to exist in the shadows because the shadows are where society prefers such things to stay. People averted their eyes, convincing themselves it was not their business. It was easier to call him a monster than to admit the truth. He was a child, abandoned by everyone, punished for sins that were not his own. In that way, his life was not only a tragedy of blood, but a tragedy of silence, a silence louder than any cry, echoing through every day he managed to endure. With each passing year, the boy's body told the story no one dared speak aloud. His growth was stunted, his limbs thin, his chest narrow, as though life itself was reluctant to stay inside him. Yet he clung to existence, a fragile reminder that some legacies cannot simply be buried. Those who saw him described the way he would stare for long stretches of time at nothing, lost in thoughts he could never fully form into words. To many it felt like looking at someone half here and half elsewhere, a living ghost trapped between worlds. His presence forced the family into deeper isolation. They stopped attending gatherings. They kept their curtains drawn. They avoided the town whenever possible. Each time they ventured out, eyes followed them, not with pity, but with contempt. It was easier for outsiders to condemn them than to ask why such unions happen in the first place. Poverty, ignorance, generational patterns that repeat when no one intervenes. But the world prefers a monster to a mirror. And so the family was painted as something other, something vile, while the society that allowed it to fester remained untouched. The boy himself seemed to absorb this rejection. He grew quieter, slower, more withdrawn. He laughed rarely, and when he did, it unsettled people, a thin, breathless laugh that seemed too fragile to belong to a child. Some said he had the eyes of someone twice his age, that he carried in his stare the exhaustion of the entire bloodline that birthed him. Children are supposed to begin fresh, unburdened by the sins of their ancestors. But this child was different. He was the sins, wearing a face, learning to walk, trying to speak. It is easy, even now, to recoil from his story, to treat him as an object of horror, a cautionary tale, something less than human. But listen closely and you realize the real horror lies not in him, but in us, in how quickly a community can turn away, in how willing we are to hide what unsettles us until it grows so unbearable it cannot be ignored. He was not a monster. He was a child born into a bloodline that devoured itself, abandoned by a world that should have saved him. By the time he reached his teenage years, the boy's condition had become impossible to hide. His speech remained broken, his movements slow and uncertain, his body frail as if every step risked collapse. Yet what disturbed people most was not his body, but his presence. There was something in his silence that unsettled anyone who stood too close. He did not rage, he did not cry, he simply existed, watching as though he carried in his eyes a knowledge no one wished to see. Some families in town began to tell their children not to go near him, claiming he was cursed, that looking at him too long would invite misfortune. Others whispered he was dangerous, though he had never raised a hand against anyone. In truth, the danger he carried was not of violence. It was of memory. He was living proof of a shame the community wanted to erase, and so they made him into something inhuman to protect themselves from guilt. Inside his home, things were no kinder. His father-uncle grew colder, ashamed of what he had created, but unwilling to accept blame. His mother-sister, crushed by the unbearable weight of being both caregiver and co-victim, began to fade into herself, her eyes dulled by regret. The boy became less a son and more a burden, a reminder they could neither love nor escape. Nights were filled with silence, punctured only by his labored breathing and the sound of whispers that stopped whenever he entered the room. This is where the cycle reveals its cruelest truth. Such children rarely live beyond adolescence. Their bodies are fragile, their organs often twisted by the very blood that should have nourished them. And yet, he lingered. Each year he survived was another year of torment for those around him, and another year the community was forced to look at what they had allowed to happen. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have turned away as so many did, or would you have broken the silence before it was too late? Because silence is what killed him. Not violence, not illness alone, but the silence of everyone who looked away, waiting for the problem to bury itself. And in the end, that is exactly what it did. When death finally came, it did not arrive with spectacle. No thunder, no storm, no great tragedy to mark the end of his short and haunted life. It came quietly, in a dim room where the air always seemed heavy, where shadows clung to corners like secrets too stubborn to fade. His body, weakened from the start, simply gave out. For the family, it was both a release and a condemnation. The child who should never have been born had left them, but his absence did not free them. It deepened the wound. There was no proper funeral, no procession of mourners, no hymns, no flowers placed gently on a casket. The family buried him quietly, almost in shame, as though even in death his existence was something to be hidden. They lowered him into the ground, not as a son, not as a brother, but as an embarrassment they could finally place beneath the soil. And yet, the earth does not erase sins. It remembers, it holds them, and every time the wind passed through those hills, locals swore it carried with it a heaviness, as if the land itself was grieving. What few outside families like this understand is that death rarely ends the cycle. His passing was not the close of a story, but another link in a chain that stretched backward and forward. His parents remained, still bound by the silence that had created him. The community, still watchful, still judgmental, learned nothing. Whispers continued, accusations shifted, but no one asked the deeper question: how had it been allowed to happen at all? The boy's grave became more than a burial site. It was a marker of what silence costs. It stood for every generation before him who looked away, every choice made in darkness, every child born into bloodlines too twisted to untangle. His short life revealed a truth that most would rather deny. Families do not implode overnight. They erode slowly, collapsing inwards until one child becomes the embodiment of all their unspoken sins. And so, his story lingered long after his heart had stopped. A warning, a shadow, a secret that refused to stay buried, no matter how deep the earth was piled above him. Long after his body was gone, the story of the boy lived on, not in records, not in stone, but in whispers that carried through generations. Some swore they saw him in dreams, standing silently at the edge of a field, his eyes heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Others refused to speak of him at all, pretending he never existed, erasing him as though silence could rewrite history. But history does not forget. It waits, patient and unrelenting, until someone dares to open the pages no one was meant to see. The boy's life was not just the story of one family. It was the story of what happens when secrecy festers, when shame is allowed to harden into tradition, when entire communities choose to look away. He was not a curse. He was not a monster. He was a reflection of the bloodlines that folded inward, of the silence that spread outward, of a world that preferred to bury its darkest truths instead of confronting them. Think of what it means to be born from a mother who was also your sister. To never once escape the shadows of your own blood. To live each day as proof of a wound no one wanted to acknowledge. That is not just a family tragedy, it is a human one. It forces us to ask, how many other children like him lived and died, forgotten, unspoken, erased by the same silence? This is why such stories matter. They are uncomfortable, they are grotesque, but they are also warnings. Warnings about what happens when shame replaces honesty, when blood becomes a prison, when silence kills louder than violence ever could. The boy's life, short and fragile, still speaks across the years. It tells us what happens when humanity turns its back on its most vulnerable. And so, the tale of the most inbred child in history is not about him alone. It is about us, about what we choose to remember and what we choose to bury, about the secrets we inherit, and the courage it takes to finally break them. The boy's grave may be unmarked, hidden in some forgotten field, but his story endures, a shadow stretching across time, daring us to look, daring us not to turn away.